The morning sun poured through the kitchen window, turning the steam rising from freshly brewed coffee into soft ribbons of gold. Claire set two mugs on the table, one with just a splash of milk, her husband's preference, unchanged since their college years. The routine was second nature, almost mechanical, and that was the first sign. She no longer needed to think about what he wanted, nor did he pause to notice that she still remembered. He slid into his chair, eyes fixed on his phone instead of her, thumbs scrolling with the kind of intensity reserved for private conversations. They had built their life on routines like this. Morning coffee, evenings spent discussing bills or scheduling their daughter's soccer practices, weekends filled with errands. On the surface, it was the picture of stability. Friends envied the ease of their marriage, the well-manicured lawn, the neat house with its symmetrical windows, the carefully staged family photos framed in the hallway. But Claire had begun to feel the hollowness beneath. Their conversations had shifted from laughter to logistics. The warmth that once lingered in the pauses between words had been replaced by silence, one that pressed in heavier with each passing day. Her husband, David, claimed work had become more demanding. He came home later and later, his shirt faintly creased as if it had been pressed against unfamiliar upholstery. The smell on him was not always cologne, but something sharper, less familiar, a mix of cigarette smoke and perfume. She asked questions at first casually, but his answers arrived too quickly, too rehearsed. The office, a late client dinner, traffic. Always simple, always neat. Claire had learned over the years that the truth rarely came packaged that neatly. It was the little things that seeded her suspicion. A jacket pocket turned inside out, a missed button on his shirt, the way he guarded his phone now as if it were a second heartbeat. When it buzzed on the counter, he scooped it up in an instant, thumb already moving before she could even glimpse the screen. He was careful, but not careful enough. One night, as she folded laundry, a receipt slipped out from his pants pocket. It was from a restaurant downtown, one she had never been to, the kind with low lighting and a menu handwritten in elegant cursive. The date matched the night he had claimed to be swamped at the office. She stared at it longer than she should have, her pulse quickening. There was no name attached to the second entree, but the weight of it pressed down like a stone in her chest. She tucked the receipt into her nightstand drawer instead of confronting him. Not out of fear, at least that's what she told herself, but because she needed to be certain. Confrontation would only bring denials, and denials would leave her stranded in the fog of doubt. She had lived long enough with the uneasy knowledge that intuition was both a curse and a compass. The next clue arrived less than a week later. He came home distracted, tossing his jacket carelessly over the back of a chair. When she picked it up, a faint smear of lipstick glowed against the collar. Not her shade, not even close. She pressed the fabric between her fingers, her stomach tightening into knots. He noticed her staring and offered an explanation before she could ask. "Someone at the office leaned in for a hug," he said, chuckling too loudly. It was awkward. He didn't meet her eyes. That night she lay awake beside him, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. Each exhale sounded steady, content, as if he hadn't woven deception into their home. Claire stared at the ceiling, the shadows shifting across the plaster. The marriage she thought she understood now felt like a stage set. Real from the front, hollow when viewed from behind. She began cataloging the changes in him. The sharper wardrobe, the gym visits explained as stress relief, the new cologne he had never worn for her. Details that once might have slipped past her now seemed to scream in unison. A story was forming, and though she didn't have all the pieces, she knew it wasn't the story he wanted her to believe. Still, she said nothing. She brewed the morning coffee, managed the schedules, smiled at the neighbors, and played her role. But in her silence, she was listening, gathering, waiting. She knew the truth was out there, and if she stayed watchful, it would slip into her hands. What she didn't yet realize was that her husband's betrayal was only the shallowest layer of the secret he carried. The lipstick and the lies were mere smoke. The fire waiting behind them would burn through the careful facade of their lives and reveal something far darker than she ever could have imagined. Claire wasn't impulsive by nature. Years of marriage had trained her in patience, in the art of waiting things out, smoothing the rough edges of conflict until life looked presentable again. But patience had curdled into something else now, an alertness, a vigilance that pulled her out of sleep before dawn and kept her heart quickening at the sound of his phone vibrating on the dresser. She decided she could no longer just collect signs like scraps of evidence. She needed to know, not guess. Her first step was small, almost trivial. She opened the banking app one morning while David was in the shower, scrolling through recent transactions. Most were mundane: gas stations, grocery stores, takeout orders. But then there it was. Charges from boutique hotels she'd never heard of, tucked between legitimate expenses. The names meant nothing to her at first, but a quick search revealed they were the kind of places that prided themselves on discretion. Hotels where nobody asked questions. She snapped a photo of the screen with her phone before the sound of the water cut off. Her hands trembled slightly as she slipped the phone back onto the nightstand. Screen dark. At work, her focus scattered. She replayed the numbers and names in her head like a code to be cracked. By the end of the day, she had mapped out a few of the hotel locations and memorized the routes. A plan began to take shape. If she couldn't confront him directly, she would follow. The first attempt nearly faltered before it began. She told him she had a late meeting at school, an excuse easily swallowed, while he claimed he had one of those client dinners again. The lie settled between them, heavy but unspoken. As he left the driveway, she waited a full 10 minutes before sliding behind the wheel of her own car, her breath shallow as she tailed the faint red glow of his taillights. It felt reckless, absurd even, but adrenaline burned through the fear. She stayed 2 cars behind, watching him weave through traffic with the confidence of someone who had made this trip many times before. When he finally turned down a street lined with glimmering hotels, Claire's stomach twisted. He parked outside one of them, a sleek glass building with tinted windows, and walked briskly inside. He never looked back. She remained in her car, nails biting into her palms, watching the door until he reemerged an hour later with a woman at his side. Young, elegant, her laugh carried easily in the night air. David's hand rested casually at the small of her back, a gesture that once had been reserved only for Claire. The sight pierced her more deeply than she had imagined it would. Betrayal wasn't abstract anymore. It had a face, a body, a shared laugh that mocked her from across the distance. Yet something in the woman's demeanor unsettled her. It wasn't joy so much as performance, a forced brightness, a quick glance over the shoulder, as though expecting shadows to emerge. Claire told herself she might be projecting, but the image stuck. Over the next week, she pushed deeper. She rifled through his jacket pockets, finding receipts folded into tiny squares, and pieced together a trail of places he'd been. A burner phone, hidden in the glove compartment of his car, nearly undid her. She only found it because the light caught the edge of plastic as she bent to grab a fallen pen. The phone contained few numbers, but the text messages were enough. Arrangements cloaked in half-phrases, coded with times and initials. Her chest tightened as she scrolled, not just from the proof of infidelity, but from the language itself. These weren't romantic exchanges. They were transactions, discussions of deliveries and arrivals that made no sense in the context of an affair. Still, she told herself she was stretching it. She needed clarity. The clarity came unexpectedly. Late one afternoon, she parked across from a cafe where she knew David often met clients. Through the wide window, she watched him lean close to the same woman she had seen outside the hotel. Their heads nearly touched as they spoke, but the woman's body language was off. Claire recognized it now. Stiffness, hesitation, the occasional glance toward the door. When David left, the woman lingered, staring into her untouched coffee as though willing herself invisible. Claire nearly approached, nearly slid into the seat across from her, but fear held her back. Fear not of confrontation, but of what she might learn if she asked the wrong question. That night, as David slept soundly beside her, she lay awake once more, replaying the images in her mind. The guarded phone, the coded texts, the woman's eyes darting toward escape. This was no longer a simple affair. Something darker pulsed beneath the surface, and her role as a scorned wife was evolving into something else entirely. She wasn't just betrayed, she was hunting. Claire had always imagined that if she ever came face to face with her husband's mistress, the scene would be loud, anger spilling into accusations, two women clawing at each other across a battlefield of betrayal. That was the picture pop culture painted. But when the chance finally arrived, it unfolded with a kind of quiet unease that chilled her more than any shouting match could. The opportunity came by accident, or maybe by instinct. Claire had noticed the woman's pattern. Every Thursday afternoon, she appeared at the same corner cafe, sitting by the window with a coffee she rarely touched. David never came with her, not during those hours. Claire guessed it was a waiting point, or maybe a place where she could vanish into the ordinary blur of people. That Thursday, Claire parked 2 blocks away and walked in with her heart hammering. She rehearsed a dozen openers on the way there. Sharp, cold, demanding. But when she finally slid into the seat across from the woman, words failed her. The woman looked up, startled. Up close, she was even younger than Claire had thought. Early 20s, maybe. Dark hair pulled back neatly, makeup precise but understated, as though curated to project elegance without drawing too much attention. Her eyes, however, betrayed her. They were wary, hollow, scanning Claire's face as if assessing whether she was friend or foe. "You don't know me," Claire began, her voice lower than she intended. "But I know who you are." The woman froze. For a heartbeat, Claire thought she might bolt from the table. Instead, she straightened, her fingers tightening around the porcelain cup. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her accent faint but noticeable. "Eastern European, perhaps." Claire leaned in. "Don't bother pretending. I've seen you with him. I know about the hotel. I know what he's been telling me." For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Then the woman's lips parted, as if to speak, but no sound came. She looked around, her gaze darting to the door, to the street outside, to the corners of the cafe where no one paid them any attention. Finally, she whispered, "You shouldn't be here." The words weren't defensive or triumphant. They were fearful. Claire blinked, caught off guard. "Why?" she asked, her voice softening. "Because if he knows you talk to me—" The woman trailed off, biting her lip. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the cup back onto its saucer. "It will be worse for both of us." Claire frowned. She had expected denial, maybe even mockery, but not terror. "Worse how? He wouldn't hurt you." The woman let out a sound that was half laugh, half choke. "You don't understand. He already does." The bluntness of the statement landed like a stone in Claire's stomach. She wanted to press further, to demand details, but the woman's posture shut her down. Every muscle seemed locked in place, shoulders stiff, jaw set. She wasn't protecting her pride. She was protecting her life. "Please," the woman whispered, eyes glistening now. "Just leave it. Pretend you never saw me." Claire leaned back, shaken. The mistress's fear wasn't the fear of a guilty partner caught in an affair. It was the fear of someone trapped, ensnared. And beneath that fear, Claire sensed something else, a plea for help smothered before it could escape. "I can help you," Claire said quietly. "If he's—" "No." The word was sharp, final. "You can't. Nobody can." Before Claire could reply, the woman rose abruptly, leaving the untouched coffee behind. She pulled her coat tight around her and walked quickly out the door, disappearing into the crowd. Claire sat frozen, the clatter of cups and low murmur of voices in the cafe suddenly too loud. She had come expecting to find proof of infidelity, maybe even some satisfaction in confronting the other woman. Instead, she had walked straight into something she didn't understand. The lipstick, the hotel receipts, the coded texts, they weren't the whole story. They were fragments of something darker, something that made a young woman tremble at the mere mention of his name. That night, when David came home smiling faintly and loosening his tie, Claire could barely look at him. He chatted casually about work, about traffic, about dinner plans for the weekend. His tone was so normal, so unshaken, that it twisted her insides. How could he play the role of devoted husband so flawlessly while leaving trails of fear in his wake? She nodded where she had to, answered in short phrases, and excused herself to bed early. But her mind wasn't resting. The woman's words echoed in her skull. "You don't understand. He already does." Claire knew now she wasn't just dealing with a husband's betrayal. She was circling the edges of something far larger, far more dangerous than she had been prepared to face. And the more she thought about it, the more one truth became undeniable. Walking away was no longer an option. Claire had once believed that a marriage unraveled in whispers, arguments muffled behind closed doors, secrets folded neatly into pockets, truths half-spoken in the dark. But what she was uncovering now was not whisper or rumor. It was an entirely different life her husband had built, hidden in plain sight. The mistress's silence haunted her, pressing into her thoughts until every idle moment was filled with questions. Why would a young woman, seemingly free to walk away, speak as though chains bound her? Why the coded texts on a burner phone, the secretive meetings, the fear that seemed to flicker in her eyes? Claire knew the pieces didn't fit into the simple outline of an affair. And if there was one thing she hated more than betrayal, it was a puzzle left unsolved. Her first discovery came while David was out, working late. She moved through the study, his territory, searching not recklessly, but with deliberate precision. He had always been meticulous, almost obsessive about order, but even meticulous men made mistakes. Behind a row of accounting books, she found a folder. Inside were papers that didn't belong to his legitimate business, contracts with companies she'd never heard of, names of shell organizations with foreign addresses, invoices stamped with symbols that looked more like codes than company logos. She sat at the desk, fingers trembling as she flipped through the documents. Numbers leapt out at her, large sums moving in and out of accounts, transfers routed through banks in cities she had to look up. Zurich, Dubai, Odessa. These weren't the movements of a man managing client dinners. They were the movements of someone laundering something too big, too dirty to be left in plain sight. The deeper she read, the more sickened she felt. Words like shipment, cargo, receiving party peppered the documents, but none of them referenced goods she could imagine. There were no product descriptions, no material lists, just codes, initials, and dates. When she cross-referenced one of the dates with a news article she pulled up on her laptop, her stomach turned cold. On the very night a shipment was marked as delivered, a local paper reported the disappearance of two young women from a nearby city. Claire shut the folder and pressed her palms hard against the desk, fighting nausea. She wanted to dismiss it, to tell herself she was drawing lines that didn't exist, but the evidence screamed too loudly. Her husband wasn't just unfaithful, he was complicit in something monstrous. The following days blurred into one another, each moment layered with dread. At the breakfast table, she studied his face, searching for cracks. David carried on as usual, flipping through his emails, complimenting the eggs she made, kissing her cheek before rushing off to meetings. His mask was flawless. The ease with which he played husband made her skin crawl. At night while he slept, she ventured further. She opened his briefcase, copied down account numbers, and even hacked into his laptop with a password she guessed from his college football number. What she found confirmed everything. His inbox wasn't just filled with corporate chatter. Buried in folders were encrypted exchanges with names she didn't recognize. Some of the messages, once decoded through a simple online key, spoke chillingly of new arrivals, buyers, and distribution routes. Claire felt the ground shifting beneath her. She had lived beside a man who could charm neighbors at barbecues, laugh at sitcom reruns, and read bedtime stories to their daughter, all while orchestrating human misery. She looked at him differently now, as though the familiar lines of his face had rearranged into something alien. But fear was not her only companion. Rage bloomed in her chest, hot and relentless. She thought of the young woman in the cafe, eyes wide with terror. She thought of the names she had read in news articles, women who had simply vanished into thin air. And she thought of her own blindness, years of overlooking late nights, of trusting too easily. The guilt weighed on her, pressing her shoulders down, but it also steeled her resolve. The more she uncovered, the more she realized the danger she was in. This wasn't just a husband's affair she could expose with a dramatic confrontation. This was an entire operation, a web spun so tightly that one wrong move could snap around her neck. She began to notice changes. A car idled too long outside their house one evening. Her phone crackled with interference during calls. Once, when she returned home early, she found her study chair slightly askew, as if someone else had been sitting there. Paranoia? Maybe. But in her gut, she knew better. David was careful, but not invincible. And if he suspected she was digging, her silence might not save her anymore. Still, she could not stop. She started compiling her own evidence. Photographs of documents, saved emails, notes cross-referencing dates and names. She stored everything on a hidden flash drive tucked inside a hollow book on her shelf. Each click of her camera, each scribbled note, felt like a small rebellion, a step toward reclaiming control. Yet she also knew she was walking a razor's edge. One misstep, one careless action, and she would not just be the wife betrayed, she would be another ghost, another name whispered in articles about women who never came home. For now, though, she played her part. She smiled when he spoke, nodded at his stories, folded his laundry, brewed his coffee just the way he liked it. To him, she was still the dutiful wife, but beneath the calm surface, she was transforming. No longer just a woman scorned, she was a woman who knew, and knowledge, she realized, was the most dangerous weapon she had ever held. The first sign that she was being watched came in the form of headlights. Claire noticed them in her rearview mirror late one evening, a pair of pale beams trailing too faithfully through the winding streets of her neighborhood. At first, she told herself it was coincidence, a car heading in, the same direction. But when she pulled into her driveway, the vehicle lingered at the corner, engine humming in the dark, before sliding silently away. She tried to dismiss it, but the tension in her body betrayed her. Her hands shook as she unlocked the front door, her ears straining for sounds behind her. Inside, the house felt less like a home and more like a stage where unseen eyes waited just beyond the curtain. The paranoia deepened over the next few days. Her phone began to behave strangely, calls dropping mid-sentence, static humming on the line, the battery draining faster than usual. She wondered if it had been tampered with, if someone had installed something she didn't understand. Once, as she typed a message to a friend, the screen flickered and froze. She powered it down and left it in a drawer, unwilling to trust it. It wasn't just the devices. She started to notice shadows in her life, small displacements that carried weight. A chair slightly out of place in the study, a window she was certain she had locked, standing cracked open, a faint smell of smoke in the air, though she hadn't lit a candle. None of it was enough to prove intrusion, but together it wove a pattern she couldn't ignore. Someone knew she was prying. David, meanwhile, remained maddeningly normal. He kissed her cheek in the mornings, called her darling in front of neighbors, cracked jokes at the dinner table. His ease was unsettling, too effortless for a man leading such a double life. She began to suspect he wasn't just hiding from her. He was testing her, watching to see if she would slip. The fear settled heavier after a visit to the grocery store. As she walked to her car, a slip of paper fluttered against her windshield, tucked beneath the wiper. She peeled it free with trembling fingers. The message was scrawled in block letters. "Stop digging, for your sake and hers." She looked around wildly, but the parking lot was empty. Her skin prickled with cold sweat. Hers. Who did they mean? The mistress? Her daughter? The thought made her stomach clench so violently she doubled over, gasping for air. That night she didn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to the quiet hum of the house, every creak magnified, every gust of wind mistaken for footsteps. She turned the note over again and again in her hands, tracing the letters as though they might reveal their author. But the truth was clear. She wasn't just uncovering her husband's secrets anymore. She had stepped into a web where every move was monitored, every silence filled with menace. The question gnawed at her. Go to the police or keep silent? Logic told her to report what she knew, but fear silenced her. What if they dismissed her as a bitter wife inventing tales? What if word reached David before they acted? And worse, what if her daughter became collateral in a fight she had started? Her unease shifted when she crossed paths again with the mistress, this time not in a cafe, but on the street outside a pharmacy. The young woman looked thinner, paler, as though sleep and safety had both abandoned her. When their eyes met, recognition flickered. Claire opened her mouth, but before she could speak, the woman shook her head violently, almost imperceptibly, and ducked inside the store. Claire followed, but by the time she pushed through the aisles, the woman had vanished. All that remained was a sense of urgency, a silent plea. The image burned itself into her mind. The woman wasn't free, no matter how polished she looked on David's arm. She was trapped, and Claire's silence would only prolong her suffering. It was then that the fear twisted into resolve. The threats, the shadows, the note on her windshield, they were meant to cage her, to remind her that curiosity could be lethal. But she understood something now. If she gave in, if she backed away, the web would remain intact. David's world would keep pulling in the vulnerable, one by one, until there was nothing left but silence. She began to shift her strategy. Instead of retreating, she grew careful. She stopped using her phone for anything sensitive, relying instead on handwritten notes tucked into places David would never think to check. She used cash for her errands, avoided routines, varied her driving routes. Every precaution became part of her new life, a dance of survival woven into her daily chores. But she also started to plan, not just to watch. She wasn't ready to bring her findings to the authorities yet, but she began looking for allies, people who might believe her if she could bring them proof. A journalist, perhaps, an officer known for integrity, maybe even the mistress herself if fear could be outweighed by desperation. The fear never left. It hovered at the edges of her day, sharp and persistent. But beneath it, something harder was forming. The woman she had been, a wife quietly enduring the cracks in her marriage, was gone. What remained was someone David had underestimated. A woman who was afraid, yes, but also unwilling to be silenced. And in the quiet hours of the night, as she stared at the ceiling once again, Claire whispered a truth to herself that steadied her pulse. Fear might trap her, but it could also sharpen her, and she intended to turn it into a weapon. Claire's transformation was almost invisible at first. To David, she still played the part of the dutiful wife, her smiles measured, her questions casual, her tone as even as ever. But beneath the calm exterior, she was no longer a woman waiting to be lied to. She was watching, recording, and laying traps with a precision David could never suspect. She began with small things, snapping photographs of receipts before slipping them back into his pockets, noting down license plates of cars that lingered too long outside their home, cataloging every irregular transaction in his accounts. She kept duplicates of everything, scattering them in places he would never think to. Look, hidden compartments in her daughter's toy chest, sealed envelopes tucked into library books. Each piece of evidence felt like a lifeline, proof that she wasn't imagining the darkness she had uncovered. It wasn't enough just to collect, though. She needed allies. Quietly, she sought out a local journalist, someone she had admired from afar for her relentless reporting on corruption cases. Claire approached her under the guise of an anonymous tip, leaving an envelope of documents at her office without signing her name. The risk was enormous, but it was a risk she had already accepted. If she fell silent, more women would suffer. Meanwhile, she continued shadowing David when she could. Once, she followed him to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. From her car, she watched him greet men whose faces were hard and expressionless, their handshakes quick and businesslike. He led them inside, and though she couldn't see what passed behind those steel doors, she heard the muffled shouts of women, brief, cut short, but enough to etch themselves into her mind. She sat trembling behind the wheel, her hand hovering over her phone, desperate to call someone. But she knew, without hard proof, all she would do was alert David and his partners that she was watching. Her fear reached its peak one night when David confronted her, not directly, but in the way predators test their prey. He stood in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, his gaze heavy as he asked, "You've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" Claire forced a smile, masking the chill in her spine. "Just tired. Long days." He studied her for a moment too long before nodding. "You'd tell me if something was wrong, wouldn't you?" The way he said it wasn't a question, it was a warning. That night, Claire barely slept, but instead of breaking, she hardened. If he suspected her, then her window was narrowing. She needed to strike first. She arranged another meeting with the journalist, this time in person. They sat in a crowded cafe, her back to the wall so she could watch every entrance. Claire slid a flash drive across the table, her hand steady despite the hammering in her chest. "If something happens to me," she said quietly, Release everything. Don't wait. The journalist's eyes widened, but she nodded solemnly. You're in deeper than you realize, but I'll make sure it sees daylight. From that point forward, Claire acted with deliberate boldness. She installed a small recorder in David's study, capturing conversations he thought were private. She photographed documents spread across his desk when he stepped away for calls. She even managed to capture a recording of him on the burner phone, arranging a shipment in terms that left little doubt about what it meant. Every step she took was a gamble. Every night she lay awake wondering if he would discover her flash drive, if the men from the warehouse would follow her again, if the journalist would vanish under suspicious circumstances. But with each piece of evidence, she built a fortress, one strong enough that even if David tried to silence her, his empire of secrets would collapse. The final push came when he confronted her outright. He caught her in the study one evening, her hand hovering too close to his briefcase. His voice was soft, but his eyes burned. You've been curious, haven't you? Her heart thundered, but she met his gaze without flinching. Curious about a husband who lies to my face? Yes. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a dangerous whisper. Be careful, Claire. Curiosity can get you killed. She didn't blink. So can arrogance. For the first time, she saw something crack in his expression. Not fear, but recognition. He realized she wasn't the same woman who once folded his laundry in silence. She was someone who could undo him. And by the time he realized it, she already had. The collapse of David's double life came quickly, though for Claire it felt like an eternity. Once the journalist released her exposé, fueled by the evidence Claire had provided, the city erupted with headlines. Prominent businessman linked to human trafficking network. Local family man exposed in international crime ring. Photographs of David, once symbols of success and stability, now plastered every screen, every front page. His smile suddenly sinister under the weight of his crimes. Claire watched it unfold from the safety of a friend's spare bedroom. She had taken her daughter and left the house 2 days earlier, unable to risk being there when the net finally closed around him. She kept the curtains drawn, the television volume low, her daughter tucked close. The child didn't understand, not fully, but she sensed enough to ask, "Is Daddy in trouble?" Claire could only nod, her throat too tight to explain. The raid came at dawn. Police swarmed the warehouse and the office, dragging men in handcuffs through the gray morning light. David himself was arrested in their driveway, his wrists bound as neighbors peered from behind curtains. Claire wasn't there to see it, but she imagined his face, caught between shock and fury, realizing that the mask he had worn so perfectly had finally shattered. The days that followed were a blur of statements, interviews, and court dates. The trafficking ring unraveled quickly once exposed. Victims began to speak, emboldened by the arrests, their stories both heartbreaking and damning. Claire listened to fragments. Women smuggled across borders, stripped of choices, sold as if they were objects. And each word deepened the chasm inside her. She had shared a bed with a man capable of such cruelty. She had built a life with him, never seeing the monster standing in plain sight. Guilt gnawed at her. How had she not known sooner? How had she let herself be lulled by excuses, by routines, by the comfort of normalcy? She told herself she was complicit only in ignorance, but the shame was a weight she carried nonetheless. Yet alongside the guilt was something else. Relief. Relief that the young woman from the cafe might finally breathe without fear. Relief that her daughter would grow up free from his shadow. Relief that the facade had finally crumbled, no matter how devastating the wreckage left behind. David's trial stretched for months, every hearing dragging their private life into public scrutiny. Claire testified, her voice steady even when her heart pounded. She recounted the documents, the recordings, the nights she followed him into the darkness. She watched his eyes follow her in the courtroom, cold and unreadable, but powerless now. When the guilty verdict came, she didn't celebrate. She sat in the courtroom, hands folded in her lap, and let the words wash over her. Life sentence. No possibility of parole. Justice, perhaps, but not closure. Closure implied something clean, and nothing about this was clean. In the weeks after, Claire returned to the house briefly to pack what she needed. The walls felt foreign, tainted by the life she had unknowingly shared with a man she no longer recognized. She moved through the rooms quietly, boxing up belongings, discarding the rest. When she closed the front door behind her, she didn't look back. Her new life was quieter, stripped of illusions. Some nights she lay awake, haunted by what she had uncovered, by the faces of the women whose freedom had been stolen. But other nights she found peace in the silence, in the knowledge that she had chosen not to remain blind. She was no hero, at least she didn't think of herself that way. She was simply a woman who had followed her instincts, even when the truth threatened to destroy her. And though the scars of betrayal and fear would never fully fade, she carried them as proof that she had survived. On a rainy afternoon months later, she sat at a cafe with her daughter, watching the world blur beyond the window. For the first time in what felt like years, she allowed herself to breathe freely. Her husband's world had collapsed. Her own had been remade from the ashes. And while the pain lingered, so too did a fragile strength, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, she had chosen to see, and in seeing she had helped bring it down.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.